Bueno, muy buen día a todas y todos. Bienvenidos a una mesa más de este ciclo de conversaciones sobre raza, racismo y antropología biológica, coordinado por el doctor Francisco Vergara. Permítanme, se me colaba el sonido desde el YouTube. Bueno, en este ciclo, ustedes saben, hemos tenido ya varias sesiones en un diálogo con especialistas internacionales que desde la antropología biológica principalmente reflexionan sobre problemáticas contemporáneas del racismo en la ciencia, ¿no? Pero también sobre las posibilidades y necesidades de construir un quehacer científico y una sociedad antirracista. Me da muchísimo gusto comentarles que esta es la mesa número 10 de este ciclo que inició ya en 2022 y estamos muy contentas de recibir en esta ocasión al doctor Svensson desde Suecia con su presentación que ahora vamos a compartirles. Les voy a poner el póster aquí mientras doy el mensaje eh, en inglés. Ahí está. A lo grande. Ok. Entonces, bueno, vamos a tener esta sesión en inglés principalmente. Ahora estoy dando este mensaje en español, pero también quiero que sepan todas y todos quienes están en el Zoom y quienes siguen la transmisión desde YouTube, que vamos a repetir, ¿no? A veces hacer la traducción, el esfuerzo de traducción de algunas partes del inglés al español y viceversa, y que ustedes pueden hacer sus intervenciones tanto en español como en inglés, y el doctor Francisco y yo, con mucho gusto, podemos ser de intérpretes y traducir si así lo desean, ¿no? Pero lo más importante es que se animen a participar y podamos continuar el ánimo de diálogo que este ciclo siempre ha tenido desde su creación. Entonces, bueno, sin más, les doy la bienvenida y voy a repetir este mensaje en inglés para el doctor Matz. ¿De acuerdo? Bueno, good morning to everyone. Perdón. Aquí. Ay. Tengo que poner tengo un tema aquí con la pantalla. Good morning to everyone. Welcome to another session of the series of conversations on race, racism, and biological anthropology, coordinated by Dr. Francisco Vergara. In these sessions, we have had a dialogue with international specialists who, mainly from biological anthropology, have been sharing with us some contemporary problems of racism in science and the possibilities and needs of building an anti-racist society and an anti-racist scientific work. This is the 10th session of this series, so we're very happy. This series began in 2022. And we're very happy to welcome today Dr. Svensson from Sweden in this occasion. Dr. Francisco is going to give us a presentation. So I just have to say to Dr. Matz that we are going to have a session in English, but in some occasions we will receive some comments in Spanish, and Paco and I will do the work of translating this so we can have this dialogue, which is the main purpose of these sessions, and it's very enjoyable to have these conversations in another very casual. We try to do this in a very casual way. So without further comments, I welcome you, everyone, and I thank you for your attendance and participation in this cycle.
Many thanks, Jimena. Welcome, everyone, especially Mats. Hello, Mats. How are you? It's great to see you, even though it's not in person, but through the little windows of Zoom. If you don't mind, I will introduce you for the audience in Spanish so that it will be easier for everybody to hear a bit about your trajectory, your academic trajectory, and especially why we have invited you to talk about, as the title states in Spanish, debates sobre biología racial y eugenesia en Suecia entre las taxonomías humanas de Linneo y los libros de texto escolares. Yo tuve el gusto de conocer al doctor Svensson hace aproximadamente 20 años, cuando viví un tiempo en la ciudad de Uppsala. Él hizo su doctorado allá en el campo de biología evolutiva de plantas y específicamente biología evolutiva del desarrollo de plantas, ¿no? Lo que se conoce aquí en México bastante bien como evodeo de plantas, ¿no? O plant evo en inglés. Después de esa estancia doctoral en Uppsala, Mats fue a Jena, en Alemania, a hacer un postdoctorado y posteriormente él estuvo interesado en el aspecto de enseñanza de la biología. Entonces empezó a interactuar de manera muy intensa, intensiva, con la educación propiamente en diferentes niveles. Y eso es lo que ha sido la mayor parte de su trayectoria laboral y profesional desde entonces a la fecha, después de ese postdoctorado en Jena. Entonces, al mismo tiempo, durante estas primeras etapas de interacción con el sistema educativo sueco en el área de biología, específicamente, él empezó a poner atención en el asunto de cómo las ideas linneanas de Carlos Linneo, el personaje del que él va a estar hablando de manera central durante una buena parte de su presentación, estaban de alguna o de otra manera en los libros de texto. Entonces, como yo le contaba a Mats hace algunos días que empezamos ya la comunicación más directa para preparar esta sesión del ciclo de conversaciones. Aquí en México, algunos de nuestras colegas en Surge, UNAM, han precisamente dedicado esfuerzos de investigación importantes al análisis de un tema muy similar, que es precisamente cómo es que las ideas, pues no necesariamente evolutivas, pero sí sin duda clasificatorias sobre la especie humana y su variación interna, están reflejadas en los libros de texto. Entonces yo creo que ese aspecto en particular, del cual Mats tiene muchísima información directa al vivir justamente en esa comunidad durante ya varios años, la manera en que él, siendo sueco además y viviendo allá, nos puede contar de cómo está este tema desarrollándose desde algún tiempo y hoy en día, y al mismo tiempo conectar eso con lo que dice el título, ¿no? La manera en que hoy en día se concibe la figura de Linneo en el contexto, pues, de esta importantísima contribución que él hizo en la ciencia occidental, que es, pues, la primera clasificación formal, digamos, de la especie humana y del género, ¿no? Hay muchas historias que contamos desde otros países acerca del papel de Linneo, pero pocas veces nos acercamos realmente a conocer un testimonio propiamente nacional sueco de cómo se da esta situación. Y bueno, como se podrán imaginar, también hay muchos asuntos contemporáneos en relación a la figura de Linneo y a otras cosas que pasaron incluso en la ciudad de Uppsala en relación a estas ideas sobre la eugenesia y esto que llamamos, entre comillas, biología racial. Y entonces de estas cuestiones que involucran instituciones y personajes académicos suecos, también Mats nos va a contar porque conoce muy bien esta historia, ¿no? Entonces, lo último que mencionaría es que Mats tiene publicaciones académicas formales sobre el tema que va a tratar, sobre todo esta cuestión de la figura de Linneo en el contexto de estas clasificaciones humanas, y yo creo que nos vamos a beneficiar bastante, tanto en Surge, en lo que tiene que ver con los temas de antropología biológica, en su relación con raza y racismo, como en otros seminarios en la UNAM que están interesados en temas de evolución desde el punto de vista histórico, filosófico y sociológico. Okay, Matt, so I have finished the presentation.
Yes.
As I introduced you, I noticed again how important it is to listen to you talking about this intersection of subjects that have Linnaeus as a central figure, but also the current debates about the legacy of Linnaeus and many other scholars that participated not only in the 18th century, but also in more recent times in Swedish academic research, and also in the interaction between the production of scientific knowledge about these topics and society itself. No?
Yeah.
So the floor is yours. Welcome again.
Oh, thank you. So I might first give credit for this image on the poster to Afrika Koy, that is an artist and a photographer that made this photo. It's like a wet plate photo that was, I think it was a bit special. Just wanted to do that. And yeah, so, and it's maybe has some connotations to some, when you think about that photography was very important in this racial biology that developed in Sweden later. Yeah. But okay, I think I start to share my presentation and start here. So, yes, I should have it as a presentation, right?
Yes, we can see it now.
Yeah, do you see it as a presentation?
Excellent.
Yeah.
This is the best format for looking at it. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. So in Sweden, there is this concept of racial biology that has some different connotations. It's both connected to eugenics and then also to physical anthropology. And what I will talk about is first Linnaeus, and then have an historical overview of this whole subject of racial biology in Sweden, and at the same time add some recent debates that have been. And then I will go to the school books that I've read through and looked about how did they deal with these topics. And I looked at geography books and biology books for the gymnasium level, that is like 16 to 18-year-old students from most of the 20th century mainly. But I haven't looked at, for example, history books and so on, which also could be very interesting in this respect. So it's more to be done. Okay, so I will start a little bit before Linnaeus. Linnaeus was mainly in Uppsala University, and he had some predecessors. One of them was Olof Rudbeck the Older. That was this abbreviation means. He was an anatomist, discovered the lymphatic system, built an anatomical theater at Uppsala University, started the botanical garden in Uppsala that later became the Linnean Garden and is still the Linnean Garden. But in this image, he's dissecting the world and he's revealing that Sweden is Atlantis, the old civilization of Atlantis, and indeed the origin of all civilization in the world. So Sweden was in this era something of it's the great power time, you might say, because it was a big power in the Baltic. Finland was Swedish, and some parts of Germany was Swedish, and then this was needed some kind of national mythology, I guess. And it's interesting when we think about what comes next, that an anatomist is also talking about the historical origin of, or the importance of the Swedes in world history. So it's like the Egyptian civilization, the Greek civilization, all of it came actually from Sweden, and he has very strange arguments for this. But he has his scalpel there and he's dissecting out Sweden as Atlantis. And this formed something called Goeticism, and that was a fascination with Nordic prehistory interpreted in naturalistic terms. And this was also because some of the Icelandic sagas has, if not been discovered, at least been more available. So people were starting to be interested in prehistory. They hadn't been before in the same way. He had a son with the same name, and he has a direct connection with the Linnaeus. He continued some of his father's work. He thought that the Sami language, the Sami that at the time was called Laps, is another ethnic group in the northern Scandinavia, present in both Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and also had a bigger, broader range at that time, actually. And he thought that this language was related to Hebrew, and he continued this. The Nordic peoples are the origin of the civilizations. But he was of direct importance to Linnaeus, because Linnaeus made a travel to Lapland in 1732 to investigate this part of the country, which was not very well known. And this was the start of Linnaeus's career. And I have a Rudbeckia here. It's a plant that Linnaeus named after Rudbeck. And then they have a example of Rudbeck's work with Natural History Bird book there. Okay, then we have Linnaeus. And in this image to the left, we see him actually in a Sami dress that he got when he was doing his expedition to Lapland then in 1732. I think it's about just almost exactly 100 year before the Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, actually, I think. But roughly. And in this exhibition, in this expedition, he studied nature, he studied the plants and the animals, and also the people, and he had very high appreciation of the Sami people. They're a more natural way of life than in the civilization, so to say. And he has some traditional dresses here, and also a shamanistic drum. Many of these were destroyed by the church later, and there are not so many original shamanistic drums this type left in the world at all, because the church destroyed them. And so to the right, I have just an example of the Hamburg Hydra. So when he was going to publish his PhD in Holland, he went through Hamburg, and then he discovered he saw this natural cabinet, or the curiosity cabinet, where they had this 7-headed hydra, and he dismissed it as a falsification because he could see that it had mixed parts from different groups of organisms that never have parts that belong together. So he found this order in nature, and he could see then that certain things you found in these cabinets were fake because they didn't fit the system. And actually in Systema Naturae that came in 1735, he actually had in the first edition a list of some mythological creatures that didn't exist. So it's significant in a way to understand his thinking. And when it comes to humans, he put the humans together with monkeys and apes in the primates, primates, which of course means the first order. So he was one of the first to say that man is an animal, or rather that man is a beast in a way. Not only, I mean, others had said that humans are animals, but he said like humans are like the other animals and can be classified in a group. It's not like man and the other animals, it's animals are among the primates. And he actually thought that there were some primates that were the cousins of man. And he actually had additional species in the genus Homo, because he, as you all know, he classified humans as Homo sapiens, the wise man. But he also thought that there existed a nocturnal variant, a night-living version of humans called Homo nocturnus or Homo troglodytes, and this was some kind of misinterpretation of albinos. He was very interested in this. And then he had heard about, from some travelers' tales, that there were people with tails, Homo caudatus. And then in another publication he has Homo lar, which is apparently was the gibbon that for some reason he classified in Homo. And then he had names for various apes that were poorly known at the time. There were names like Pongo pygmaeus and Satyrus, that were the orangutan and what you know about chimpanzees and so on. And you can see then illustration here from this anthropomorpha. However, when it comes to our species then, he also listed some varieties of this. He didn't call them races. He didn't. I think this word wasn't really established yet. And he describes their skin colors. And Europeans are at the top of this. Now I don't see the image myself really. Yeah, and it put first the Europeans in at the top. So if you see to the right, H, there is humans then, Homo, and you have Europeans, that is white, and Americanus, that is red, and Asiaticus, that is yellowish, and Africanus, that is black then. So this is, it's in the first edition, what he says about this variant. It doesn't say very much. And you can also note that he has a description of man, he has nosce te ipsum, that means know thyself. So he doesn't write a long description of what humans are like. It's more like, yeah, take a look at yourself. That's the human. In later editions, he has a more elaborated descriptions of these variants, and he has also changed the order in which he presents them. So he has the Americanus at the top, and you can see there are Greek letters like alpha, beta, gamma, delta that might indicate some hierarchy, might just also indicate that you order them somehow, but there are reasons to believe that this is actually a hierarchy. So what does it say about the Americanus? Yeah, these people are red, choleric, straight, since they're in childhood are wound at a board. Hair is black, straight and thick, nose broad, face with freckles, chin almost beardless. They are stubborn, happy and free, paints himself with fine red lines, and is ruled by customs. He continues with Europeus, that is white, sanguine and muscular. Hair is yellow and plentiful, eyes are blue. Is changeable, clever, subtle, inventive, dresses in tight clothes, and is ruled by fashion. The Asiaticus is yellow, melancholic, stiff. The flesh is dried out. Hair is blackish, eyes dark, is serious, proud, greedy, dresses in loose clothes, and is ruled by opinions. And Afar, that's African then, is black, phlegmatic, slack, flaccid flesh, hair black like coal, curly, velvet-like and smooth skin, flat nose, swollen lips. The females have folds of shame, breast overproducing milk, reach the knees, sly, lazy, indifferent, doesn't worry, knows himself with fat, and is ruled by arbitrariness. And these that are in parentheses, that's from lecture notes. And I got this from Gunnar Broberg, that's had and you can see this in several sources now, but he translated this into Swedish from the Latin in the 1970s in a dissertation about Linnaeus' thoughts about man. Okay, so he's saying a lot of things here, what these peoples are like. And what I am focusing on here, it's mainly that he is saying that the Americans are choleric, the whites are sanguine, and the yellow, the Asiaticus, is melancholic, and the Afar is phlegmatic. And why did he assign these different temperaments to these different variants? Before I answer that, I should note that one of the disciples of Linnaeus, Per Kalm, in the 17, also from the 1700s, of course, he might have been the one that changed this, that influenced Linnaeus to change the position of Americanus to the top, because Kalm had visited North America around 1750 and admired the American Indians. And the one proposing this was actually a late representative of the Swedish race biology tradition that we will get back to. But this might be true, because Per Kalm then was more of an Enlightenment figure than Linnaeus. Okay, so what I concluded then by thinking about this, why did Linnaeus assign different temperaments according to skin color? And then I was thinking about this relationship between the different temperaments that had been around since antiquity, and that also included the relationship between the 4 elements and the 4 bodily fluids. So all of this was thought to be connected. So blood was connected to the sanguine temperament. Water was connected to phlegm and the phlegmatic temperament. Earth was connected to black bile and the melancholic temperament, and fire to yellow bile and the choleric temperament. And if we put these different varieties of man then in this diagram, we will see that, for example, Americanus, its skin color appears to be determined by blood, since it's presented as red, whereas the temperament is determined by the next in this direction, the next bodily fluid or humor. Body humor is the correct term in English. The yellow bile, so it will be choleric. And the Asiaticals then, the yellow bile influences the skin, whereas the next temperament makes him melancholic, right? So it seems to fit in this old teaching of the humors. And then the Africans, they are black. It's determined again from this direction, and his inner properties, his temperament, is then determined by phlegm, and is phlegmatic. And when it comes to the European, he is white like phlegm, but he's sanguine because of the blood then that it determines his temperament, sanguine temperament. So this appears to be that Linnaeus was sitting and thinking about what temperaments must these people have from their skin colors, basically, and using this traditional way of thinking about how we get our temperaments as the basis for this. We should then also remember that this doesn't mean that Linnaeus thought that these variants were like races in a later sense, that they had immutable characteristics. Rather that these characteristics might change if these people move to other parts of the world that are wetter or drier or something like that, because these factors, wet and dry, was also part of this system, and it was part of the medicine at the time. So it's not clear that he actually thought about this as racial characteristics, but rather maybe something that was caused by the environment. That's unclear. But this seems to be clear, though, that this is how he thought. This is what I published in this publication. He also has a 5th variety, and that's the monstrosities. These are sometimes interpreted as monsters, but that's perhaps not correct. It's more like these are people that are deformed by or changed by the environment. So there are mountain people that are small, agile and frightened. Patagonians are tall and slow. Hottentots were said to be single testicles, which one of his disciples then dismissed. And then you also have the rush-like girls with laced waists. That's the Europeans. And then you have people that have deformed their heads in various ways. So that's the monstrosities. And actually, what's cited, I never understood why it was cited in this book. But this title of this book is a Finnish book. I haven't been able to read it. It's sickly beautiful, and that is like we have this expression also in Swedish, like, yeah, that's sickly good or that's sickly beautiful. And I guess it's discussing this thing with the rush-like girls, that in order to be beautiful, people might violate their bodies in various ways. But it's also worth pointing out that since the monstrosities is the lowest, it's clear that Linnaeus does not rank European culture necessarily as superior. And he also had this the highest ranking of the Amerikaners, and also that he greatly admired the Sami people, the Lapps as they were called back then. And now I can get into some of the recent discussions about this. So in 2020, there was a petition as part of the BLM movement.
Black Lives Matter, right?
Huh? Yeah,
Black Lives Matter. Yes.
Yes. So you can see here that we have a statue. This is one in Lund, where they have written BLM, Black Lives Matter. And yes, you can see that what he wrote about Africans were perhaps not very nice things in many respects. And then in this petition, to take away a lot of statues of Linnaeus, at this time you remember that very many statues of racist figures were taken down. It was claimed that his words have been quoted, and he then is Linnaeus, of course, have been quoted when people have explained why they killed, tortured, enslaved, and eradicated. In schools, however, we have only been taught a clearly biased version of Carl, the side that taught us about wood animals and fir trees. And then we see to the right here, it's a long text here, but that's from a cultural commentary in one of the bigger newspapers, and it's supporting these ideas that the statues should be taken away. And yeah, I might read it actually. The scientist Carl von Linné, and yeah, you might have noticed that Carl von Linné is what Linnaeus is called most often in Sweden, has suddenly become controversial in Sweden. A petition, let's remove this again. A petition inspired by the International Way of Statues protests following Black Lives Matter has gathered nearly 2,000 signatures. We demand that the statue of Carl von Linné be taken down. And then people have responded that this is exaggerated. So this tendency to downplay Carl von Linné as a peripheral in the history of racism is, however, incorrect. Linné was one of history's most central, most influential and important racist ideologues, at least according to international racism research, which devotes significant attention to Linné's influence in scientific literature. It's time for Sweden to confront this fact. Yeah, and he goes on and say that he, of course, didn't invent racism, but he invented scientific racism, according to this commentary. That was then based on science. And you can see this yourself. And Yeah. In this case, I would find this, and this would be interesting to hear opinions about this. I find it slightly exaggerated because it's not really clear that the things that he wrote, first of all, that all the things he wrote about different peoples actually influenced later races and ideas about race. Of course, they knew about his division of mankind, and it's also not really clear that he was racist in the later meaning of the word, at least. It's also worth noting, which I will come back to, that it's clear that the later scientific racism, as we will see, is focused on the brain. And this idea that the brain determines your temperaments and so on, it's not really yet there. Linnaeus is still very much a part of an older tradition. So many have actually pointed out that we often see him as a part of the Enlightenment and the new science, but in many ways he's like the last of an older tradition. So it's like it's more Aristotle than the modern philosophers in Linnaeus' thinking. So this idea that you see that often that Enlightenment represented a new scientific way of looking at man, and this gave rise to modern racism. You can't really, I think, put Linnaeus there. But I'm open to different opinions about this. In this particular case, I think the statue should be left because it's also not the most important thing he contributed, I would say. Okay, I can continue then. This is not Swedish, but it's the next step in this, and it's a link in a way. Blumenbach, he built on Linnaeus, but as you may know, instead of 4 races, he introduced the Malay race also. And I have written a little bit what he says about some of these varieties, because this will be important later on. That the Caucasian variety is Europeans except for Lapps and the Finns. And those instead belong to the Mongolian variety. So they're, according to Blumenbach, quite distinct from other Europeans, which is then interesting because they are then living in close proximity to Swedes. And this will influence Swedish thinking. But I think, as far as I know, Blumenbach is an important racial classifier, so to say, but could also be said to be one of the least racist Europeans of his time. That if someone has an opinion about that, we could discuss that as well, but that's at least what my impression from what I've read. That he found that people of African origin have the same mental capabilities as Europeans and so on. I think I happened to miss the African variety in this list here, but it's there also. Yeah. Okay, then we come back to Sweden. And then we have Anders Retzius. And he was, at the time, one of the most important scientists. And he was professor of anatomy and physiology at the Karolinska Institutet in Stockholm. That was quite new then. The only competing scientists at the time in influence and importance was the chemist Berzelius that gave us the abbreviation of the elements that we still use. That N is nitrogen and O is oxygen and so on. That's Swedish. So and they were friends also. And he was interested in the brain then, and note the change from humors to the brain in what controls the mind. And he dismissed phrenology, the idea that you could say something about the person's personality by feeling on the outside of the brain. Because he studied brains, he studied skulls, and he saw that no way that the brain could press on the skull and change its shape. But he did introduce terminology of describing skulls, and the terms dolichocephalic, with those with long skulls, and brachycephalic, those with short skulls. And zoologist and archaeologist that was contemporary, he compared the skulls that he found in excavations with those in Retzius' collection, and he made the conclusion that dolichocephalic Germanic people had replaced brachycephalic Mongol, that's from Blumenbach, then Lapps, quotation marks, in Swedish prehistory, so that a new race had come in and replaced an older race, so to say. And this also becomes very important. And here we have some images of skulls with the long skulls and short skulls according to Retzius, what he introduced from a later work. And it's not only that Retzius then said that, some people have short skulls and some have long skulls, but also that those with long skulls are superior. And this was, I found this in Stephen Jay Gould, The Mismeasure of Man, but I have retranslated this from the Swedish again, because I read it in Swedish. And since Mr. Retzius' work, scientists have generally considered, without sufficient study, that dolichocephaly is a measure of superiority. Perhaps it is, but we should remember that dolichocephalic and brachycephalic characteristics were first studied in Sweden, then in England, the United States, and Germany, and in all these countries, especially in Sweden, there's a clear predominance of the dolichocephalic type. It is a natural tendency in humans, even among those most free from prejudice, to believe that the dominant characteristics of their race are a sign of superiority. And this, of course, was insightful of Broca, but we all might also know that he said some not so free from prejudice things about women, for example, and their brains. So, maybe he's an example of what he himself concluded there. There's also parallel cultural development in Sweden at the time. There is renewed interest in the Vikings and the Germanic past that had been largely dormant since the times of Rudbeck. In the 1700s, people didn't care much about this. And this was again called Goethecism. And there is actually still a society that is called the Goethic Society, and they have this motto that the ancient times, future, and the present, the responsibility of the present is the responsibility of the present. And I have this. You could see this in literature and art, and I have here the Thor is fighting with the giants from 1872. That's slightly later, but this was the entire 1800s. That there was this idea of the Germanic past that was going to be renewed and vitalize the nation. Right. Yeah, and I've zoomed in a significant part of this painting at the bottom there that you can see. Gustav Retzius, then I continue with him now. He is the son of Anders Retzius, and I think I took this from Encyclopedia Britannica, the first quote, anatomist and anthropologist, best known for his studies of the histology of the nervous system. He was very many ways progressive. For example, in the emancipation of women. So he wanted to abolish the male guardianships for women, and that Sweden's first professor, Sonja Kowalewskaja, should be allowed to join the Royal Swedish Society of the Sciences. So we have a person with a progressive part here that we think, yeah, these are good things. But then he also continued the work with physical anthropology. Again, I mean, yeah, you can do physical anthropology, but again with this idea of Swedish superiority and also Swedish superiority over the Sami people that together with Swedes then inhabit northern Sweden and Norway and Finland. And he carries out a large mapping of the Swedish people, which was presented in 1902 in a work called Antropologica Suecia. And this is kind of the start of the race biology, you might say, in Sweden. You can see that he's doing skull measurements there on a Sami person. And the Karolinska Institute where both of these Retziuses were working, have in the recent years been reevaluating the legacy of Retzius. And I've taken this from their homepage, what I have been doing the last decade. And in KI then is the Karolinska Institutet. They assume responsibility for the skull collection that Anders Retzius started to build then, and begins an identification process. And they are then prioritizing repatriations. And this is to Finland and French Polynesia and very many, and even North America, I think, that they had skulls then. And all of these skulls were not collected in an ethically correct way. So in 2018, a bust of Gustav Retzius is placed in storage. And in 2020, a bust of Anders Retzius displayed on campus is removed and placed in storage. And then there is in 2021, the name Retzius should be removed from a lecture hall at the campus. And in 2024, there's a repatriation of the remains of a Sami woman who was found at Koi in 2022, and we will get back to this. This was a skeleton that was thought to have been lost in a fire, I think, but then it was found again in 2022, which was stolen actually. So, yeah, so that's the reason, this stolen material, that's the reason why the busts are taken down. And then Mendelism comes, and Sweden is quite early have prominent geneticists. Herman Nilsson Ehle, still famous for every plant geneticist, plant breeder, and introduced Mendel in Sweden. So he introduced a lot of important grain varieties. And another, Wilhelm Johansen, also an important Danish geneticist, perhaps more famous than Nilsson Ehle, said that Nilsson Ehle's dissertation was the most important advance since Mendel's principle gained acceptance. And that is because, as you can see to the right, Herman Nilsson Ehle actually explained how quantitative traits also could be explained with Mendelian laws. And if you link this to the anthropometric studies course, there was nothing known about the Mendelian genetics of it, but this linked quantitative traits to genetics, and that it followed the same routes, which was, of course, was very significant. So other traits that eugenicists like Galton and so on in the 1800s had been interested in, those were, of course, quantitative traits. And now it seems that quantitative traits, just like any other traits, is genetically determined. So that might be the reason why he is endorsing the Race Biology Institute that will be founded, as we soon see, in Uppsala then. So he involved in the establishments of an Institute for Livestock Breeding, Association of Tree Breeding, and the Department of Fruit Tree Breeding, and then Human Breeding. Now it's called the State Institute for Racial Biology. As we can see, it's central scientific figures that are involved in this, that you can't just dismiss what Herman Nilsson Ehle did as only pseudoscience. I mean, this his work with the grain varieties is still in all biology textbooks, right? But still he endorsed this State Institute of Racial Biology, that we will come to next. And that was led by a guy called Herman Lundborg. That's now very infamous person in Sweden. And he was inspired by the work of Gustav Retzius, this anthropological work of mapping the anthropology of the Swedes. And first he studied a family in southern Sweden and concluded that a form of epilepsy was a Mendelian recessive trait. And he continued then to speculate about this family, that about a general degeneration in the family, like to crimes and all kind of bad things that they were doing, and that it was increasing through the decades, and that was mainly after his dissertation about this family in 1911. I haven't read it, but I assume that is less pseudoscientific than what he's talking about this family later. And then in 1922, he becomes the leader of the State Rasbiologiska Institutet in Uppsala, which is the Race Biology Institute, which was then established after a broad political consensus. Riksdagen, that's the parliament. So all political parties were endorsing this. In Sweden, there was a quite young democracy at the time, actually, but also the Social Democrats, the left, were supporting this work. And Herman Lundborg, he was very interested to examine the effect of racial mixing between Swedes and Lapps. And an inspiration in this was Eugen Fischer, a prominent German anthropologist that had studied racial admixing with Germans in Southwest Africa and had very ugly things to say about these people that he studied. And just like Fischer, Lundborg spent much time photographing, and he was photographing the Sami people in similar ways. But he was also taking nude photos, which was not with the consent that these also should be published for everyone to see later on. And his attitude toward the Sami people was clearly colonial. So Herman Lundborg had this idea that this area where these natives, so to say, were still roaming, it should be replaced with Swedes that were better to take care of the natural resources that are plentiful there, like iron and the woods, and also, of course, electricity, water power. And in this work, he developed a fieldwork friendly system to write down the things about the people. And this has actually been shown to be the direct ancestor for the cards later used by the SS when they were running around and writing down the characteristics of the people they were going to deport or exterminate. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of that card here, but it's some features are similar. And actually, this is outlined. There's a recent book that came out just a few years ago by historian Maya Hageman, that also have written a really good book about the 1800s, this natural romanticism and the archaeology mainly, but also the work of Retzius and Retzius. And how this then later inspired Nazis and so on, this idea about the Nordic race and so on. And what you can see in the background of this book cover is actually one of these cards that he developed. Okay, but what is very odd is that he then had this very strong opinion against racial admixture, and he said that it was like you shouldn't Swedes and Lapps, yes, they were called, should not mix. But he actually had a child with one of his assistants, Maria Isaksson, that's in the picture here also, that was a woman of exactly the race that he deemed inferior, which is a very odd irony in this. And she actually continued to work as his assistant at the Race Biological Institute in Uppsala. So this book is not available in English. It's definitely worth reading. It's available in German. It's been translated to German. And it's based then on letters, his private letters and letters to colleagues, especially in Germany. And and this also has now come back to what's this has been talked about recently. So there is a strong I would say strong emancipation from Sami people, and the picture in the middle is from a recent movie that deals with this topic about a Sami girl that goes to Uppsala and experiences the race biology. And then there is a recent comic book about actually exactly this this skeleton, or that was discovered in Karolinska Institute, and that was stolen. This was a special woman that she was unusually tall, over 2 meters tall. And this was, of course, very interesting. So when she died, her skeleton was stolen and taken to Karolinska, and now it then has been found again and repatriated this year, actually. And the same person that made this comic book also made a a graphic novel is the correct term, about his family, that is Sami people, he's from Sami descent, and also about how Herman Lundborg made his measurements on the people there. So there's quite a great awareness, which is good, about this in Sweden. and it's discussed quite a lot. It used to be like a hidden history, and now it's talked about very openly. And there is movies, books, theater plays about this. It's very much discussed, and most people are very aware of this part of history, and that it was a bad thing. Okay, let's move on. After the Race Biological Institute, Gunnar Dahlberg replaced Herman Lundborg when he retired, and Gunnar Dahlberg opposed Herman Lundborg's racial theories and changed the direction of the institute activity from racial hygiene to genetic hygiene. And Lundborg strongly disapproved of this appointment. He didn't like him, and in 1956, the Institute of Racial Biology became the Department of Medical Genetics. So there was a big change where this institute went to, dismissed its older anthropological tradition, more or less. Gunnar Dahlberg did not like Herman Lundborg, and Herman Lundborg did not like Gunnar Dahlberg. But however, it's what continued and also has been discussed is that there was quite a large racial hygiene, hereditary hygiene, sterilization program that's not directly connected. It's of course connected to the Race Biology Institute, but what happened was that there was a discussion about the need for this sterilization. And there was the first sterilization law in 1935. Again, this was approved by most political parties. And it was further developed in 1941, and it was sharpened. And this law then, it's one form or another was then from 1935 to 1975, and about 60,000 sterilizations were undertaken under this law. And 90% of those sterilized were females. And this you might ask why. Was it because there were stricter norms against deviant behavior? We will get into why people were sterilized. Many actually pointed out that males were, from an eugenic perspective, more important to sterilize. But for women, sterilization was coupled to abortion. And these sterilizations were officially not, you couldn't force someone to do it, but you were blackmailing people then. So if you want an abortion, you must sterilize. And there was different indications, like reasons for sterilization, and the eugenic is just one of them. The medical indication is that this woman can't have children because that would mean medical threat, direct physical harm to her or the child. It's claimed then. And then the social indication is not eugenic, but it's like this person cannot take care of children, so the children will grow up under bad conditions. So it's not to save the future race, so to say, mainly in this argument, but that we shouldn't have children growing up in bad conditions. And then this medical indication, it's applied only to women, of course, and that's the biggest one. So that's why mainly women were sterilized. But it's also clear that from the real reason could have been social or eugenic, or rather eugenic, but people didn't want to tell that. They didn't want to say that, so they said medical indication, not to make someone feel bad that there was something mentally wrong with them or something like that. right? So yeah. So about 60,000 sterilizations, and this have been, and then you can see it goes up here, but that's the total amount of sterilizations. After the law is gone, people can sterilize themselves just as they want. They didn't need a permission to do it, so that's why it goes up. But this eugenic, this social engineering then ends. So part of it is social engineering, part of it is, so to say, genetic engineering. And it's hard to distinguish the two, actually. And this also has been very much debated. There's a movie about that, just to show that it's been very much debated. And what's very upsetting about this, that there is a lot of very narrow-minded moralism when you read why people were sterilized. I don't need to read all of this, but like the father's mother and the father's father are said to have been petty thieves. I mean, this maybe wasn't the only reason, but they have been writing these things about these people, so it's very upsetting. And there is also a concept called tattare, that was some Swedish people with a different way of life. They were considered to be a mixed race with gypsies. Some quotation marks. It's not a correct term. But this was actually dismissed by Dahlberg because it was dismissing a lot of, because he was doing this anthropometric work that Lundborg wanted him to do earlier. And he just said, no, there is no difference between these people. I mean, no, you can't tell these people apart from their physical characteristics. So he dismissed this as some kind of mixed race. But yeah, it's a very dark part of history, of course, all of this. And what's been much debated is that Alva and Gunnar Myrdal, these were the architects in many respects of the Swedish welfare system, social democrats. And they supported the sterilization policy in a book called Crisis in the Population Question from 1934. This was mainly about that there was a decline. There was mainly demographic problems, not mainly eugenic, but demographic problems. And it was mainly about, like, let's have welfare for people. But this meant that society's pace and the demands on the individual that had increased so much, and that had deepened the life, deepened the life problems for the non-top worthy, as they stated. And as part of the prophylactic social policy, as they also call it, they advocated sterilization, for example, of the feeble-minded. So they supported this. And this, of course, when people rediscovered this was a major scandal, of course, because it was realized that the social democrats that were also part of this. But we should also remember that Gunnar Myrdal had another side also. You might have heard about the Un-American Dilemma, a book he wrote about the USA, and where he says that the biological ideology had to be utilized as an intellectual explanation of and a moral apology for slavery in a society which went out emphatically to invoke as its highest principles the ideals of inalienable rights of all men and freedom and equality of opportunity. So here he has clearly, like, not supporter of racism in any way, actually, but still a supporter of eugenics to some degree, at least, in 1934. And I've shown this because Sweden then, in the 1960s, especially here as exemplified by speeches of Olof Palme. I will not read this entire thing, but it's like the self-image now becomes that Sweden is a anti-racist, anti-colonial country. So, for example, there was strong opposition against the Vietnam War. and also again about the double standards then of the West, that on one hand celebrating liberty and freedom, and on the other hand causing oppression and persecution in other countries. And there is a very much quoted, it's a very nice speech against racism and why people become racist. But I highlighted a part here, also from 1965, that market racial theories have never gained a foothold here in Sweden, which is, we have seen then that this is not perfectly true, right? But this is the self-image of Sweden in the 60s and 70s, that this is a anti-colonial, anti-racist country, and it's like a Goldilocks country. It's not too capitalist, not too socialist. We don't like the Vietnam War. We don't like when the Soviet Union oppresses the Eastern Europe. Like everything is just perfect. And then people then rediscovers this legacy. And in 1997, especially in 1997, there is a journalist that discusses eugenics, and he says that this was at the core of social democracy. Eugenics and the purging of the inferior was primarily a social democratic project. In Sweden, sterilization surgery was part of the very foundation of the People's Home Project, and that was the name for the welfare state from the 1930s. So of course, not everyone agreed with this, and that this was unfair. And actually, some of the researchers that have been doing the research on this were very much opposed to this interpretation of this as mainly social democratic. And also in the 1980s and 1990s, it was already starting to be discussed, but then it was mainly that in relation to new genetic tools, we shouldn't have a new eugenics movement of any sort. And then actually I think this actually started that this history was rediscovered. When people started to think, okay, what should we do with the new diagnostic tools we have in medical genetics? We shouldn't have human enhancement. And then, but didn't people do that in history? Did we do this here? Yeah, we did. And then this discussion started in the 1990s, very much. And this is also related to another dark thing. There's a thing called lördagsgodis, which is that you should only eat sweets on Saturdays. And that was also an experiment undertaken on people with mental disabilities, that they were eating candy, and they were seeing how caries developed. And this also has been very much discussed. So people are quite aware of this history, I think. Okay, then I have the school books. Maybe we should have some questions now, or should I continue? There's a lot of quotes from these books.
Max, yes. Why not we take a few minutes in case there are questions from the audience? I don't see anything in the chat yet, so in the Zoom room that we are. But perhaps Jimena has seen something in the YouTube session that is being transmitted simultaneously. Is there anything there?
Not yet. No questions specifically. Some comments.
Okay.
And but I don't know if you want to share some impressions and then go on.
Well, yes. Well, for me, obviously, I think the richness of this presentation is astounding, because the connection that we see so far between the specifically scientific developments over centuries, actually, including many characters, and interestingly also sometimes family relatives, no? For example, you have the Retzius father and son, and Rudbeck also the same, and actually Linnaeus actually also had sons that
Yeah,
were
that's true.
into
That's
natural history. So that's a very interesting feature, right, of the development of these intellectual academic communities in Scandinavia and in Sweden in particular. But I was going to say that the way in which maths has connected the political realm and dimension of things is actually quite enriching for us here in Mexico. We are, as I have mentioned to Mats before in previous conversations, we're too much accustomed to have this comparison with the situation in the United States, for instance, on the one hand, and in some Latin American countries, for instance, Brazil. It's a country in which we sometimes try to look in the mirror, so to speak. No, so looking at Northern Europe in this way is quite interesting because there are many parallelisms. Actually, no, you have also an ideology that is pushed by the state that somehow is linked to the creation of national identities, and at the same time is pushing to the margins certain human groups within the nation, right? And there is this hierarchization of value of peoples which have this or that or those physical characteristics. And many times then the discipline that we know as physical anthropology gets in the way or participates in one way or another in the creation or in the making these ideas much more strong, right? In the eyes not only of state functionaries, for instance, but also in the eyes of society as a whole. So that would be a first comment that I would make.
Yeah, and also that it is part. I mean, the racialist part, the prejudice, and the nationalist part is part of the science. It's not part of the science really, but it's part of the scientists' worldview and why they also why they say why we must do this.
Yeah,
right. Why it's important for society. Right. And sometimes you think is it mainly to say to someone, maybe I just want to go and collect skulls and compare them. I think this is interesting, the history. Yeah, why is this important? Someone asked, like a scientist, why is this important?
Right.
Yeah, also, the nation.
Yeah.
Right.
There is this idea of nation building all the time, no?
Yeah.
Even hundreds of kilometers apart, that idea pops up here and there, and sometimes with a lot of strength. Also, I wanted to mention, Mats, that at some point you have told me that there was a connection between these developments in Sweden with the National Socialist Party in Germany, right? Maybe at this point, before we enter in the final section about school book materials, maybe you can say something about this connection.
Yes, I mentioned one briefly there that, Herman Lundborg, he was, I think, one of the few, not one of the few, but he was very befriended with the corresponding persons in Germany. Like we have names like Eugen Fischer and
exactly. You mentioned Fischer, right?
And Erwin Bauer, that also, like Nilsson Ehle, was a prominent plant geneticist also, and he communicated with them. And actually, I didn't really put that in, I think, but in around 1910, Herman Lundborg reads Gobineau, the French, but also actually was for a period in Sweden, actually. And that this is the mid-1800s, I think he wrote these things, but it became popular in the early 1900s. And this idea with the Nordic people, and that all the civilizations are founded, all this, it's similar to Rudbeck in a way, and that's why that all the cultures emanate from the Germanic peoples, right? So the Germanic peoples have spread from the north, and when they have reached different parts of the world, the big civilization have emerged. But when they have mixed then with other people, the civilizations have been falling down. They have collapsed. So it's the German race that builds culture. And when it mixes with others, the cultures collapse. And that's exactly what they were afraid of. They believe this, of course. So that was what Herman Lundborg was afraid of, or Sweden. And then actually, I didn't mention, but there is a German, that is really pseudoscience, one called H.F.K. Günther, that wrote about the races of Europe.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Günther, yes. And he was very influenced by Lundborg, and they influenced each other. So they were like friends, right? And they actually was at Rasbiologiska Institute for a while.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So this is very strong connection here.
Right.
It's and also the earlier cultural development with the nationalism in the 1800s is directly linked to similar developments in Germany. So Sweden is very central in this, actually. It's not a flattering thing, but that's the case, right?
That is the case, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this clarification, Mats. I believe there is a comment by Daniela Ballesteros, who is with us now in the Zoom room. So, Jimena, would you like to translate Daniela's question?
Yes. Thank you very much, Daniela, for your comment and question. I'm going to translate. So, historically, after the Cold War, indigenous peoples and nations mobilized to exercise their rights to recognition and reparation for crimes committed during the construction of nation states. No? What happened in Sweden in this context? Yes.
Yeah,
I'm going to copy the question here in English.
Yeah. I think mainly when we talk about reparations, I think what's going on, it's mainly going on now with what I said about Karolinska Institute. That they are giving back. I didn't write you can read about it on their homepage. I didn't quote everything here, but they have scouts from other parts of the world that they have sent back. If they know where they come from, they have sent it back. And also then from similar plans for Finland and the Sami nation, so to say. Yeah. And it's also then, I mean, the self-image of Sweden from the 1960s onward was that, yeah, we're anti-colonial, right? We support ANC in South Africa. We support the Vietnam peoples that they shouldn't, against the Americans in the Vietnam War and so on. So that we have this history is like something that was forgotten for many. Maybe that's not an answer to the question, but I don't know everything about ethnographic museums and so on, what they are doing, but there are things going on there also.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else in the room has another question for Matt, or do you want to go on with the presentation? And
I have already started looking at a series of short comments by the same person who is attending the session in YouTube. Probably if Mats continues with the final part of his presentation, and then I can make sense of what is in YouTube, and perhaps we can start with that for the second round of the Q&A.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so in the late 1800s, so I'm starting with the geography books. There are some authors here from that. This one called Erslev, and another that is a short version. I don't care which exact book it is, but it's mainly the same authors here. And they are mainly saying that, people have been trying to classify humans, like Blumenbach's classification, the Caucasian, Mongolian, Malayan, and Ethiopian races, and the American race. But then they also stress that there is no satisfying way of classifying humans. I mean, no one can agree on anything, right? And it's not considered important with a distinction between a classification based on race as a biological concept and one based on culture. So it's not yet really this race thinking that we see. And then they say, there's a quote here, upon the division of the human race, one does not only take physical characters into account, but also the languages. And then they have a list of major peoples of the earth, and when they are grouped according to the physical and linguistic kinship. And what then is called Finns, including Estonians, Lapps, that's quotation marks, and Magyars, as Hungarians, is in this classification regarded as belonging to the same race as Mongols and Manchurians. So these people are then based on language, basically. They're not considered to be the Caucasian race. Yeah. And I have some, also from 1800s, some things I found interesting. They list some things about America, and maybe what I say about what they call the Indians then. Many of the Indians are copper-colored in complexion, redskins, but otherwise their color ranges from black to yellow and even to white. And I found this a bit perplexing, this thing. I was almost thinking that maybe just a few hours ago that maybe this is some idea that the new world should have the same composition of people as the old world. I have no idea. This could be some really old thoughts. I have no idea where it comes from. Maybe, yeah, I found this a bit strange, right? That you have this variety. Yeah, and then they also rank some people, like Australians, that they are the lowest of humans, and both the Papuans and the Alfurus are very crude and generally not receptive to culture. So there you have some prejudice, of course. It would be very hard if you wouldn't have it. And then there is an interesting link between that's somehow suggested. It's not explicitly, but light skin and receptiveness to European culture. And this is about the Polynesians. I didn't write it here, but this is about Polynesians. Their skin color is often almost white, and they are very receptive to European civilization and are already largely Christianized. And the Oceanians again then, on many islands, exchange a large part of their own customs and practices for European ones. Christian missionaries have preached the gospel. European clothing has displaced the original attire. And on the Sandwich Islands, and that's Hawaii, I think, there are now newspapers, cafes, and billiards. In these islands even form a constitutional kingdom where the king makes all decisions in a consultation with his ministers and parliament. And we will see this later also, that Polynesians are like, yeah, those are quite good. They are almost like Europeans, right? This will appear later also in the geography books. Yeah, I'll go on. Yeah, this is the same book. No, this is another book. Sorry, it disappeared a thing here. This is a completely different book. That doesn't talk much. Is Fritjof Berg. He's actually very important in school history in Sweden. And he writes some things about people from different parts of the world, but you have the worst fault of the French is that he teaches them is that it's their vanity. And people from Montenegro are wild and cruel. But it's these short mentions of, yeah, you know the French, their vanity and so on. But he doesn't say anything if this has some biological underpinning or if this is just cultural differences, right? So it's not this racial thing yet. So sorry for missing the half of this slide, and I don't know what happened there. But then there is one, Hans Karlsson. He lives in the late 1800s, but his name appears on geography books until the 1940s, actually. And actually, my father had one of these books in when he was in school in the 40s. So we had this at home. And here, physical and cultural characteristics are in earlier editions. There is no clear distinction between cultural and biological traits. Like in the earlier books I mentioned, they just, people are different in these ways, but it's not like this is biology. But in a late edition, we do find a definition of race based explicitly on physical traits, and those are called racial characteristics. And of course, the treatment of Africans is strikingly racist. I mean, you can't almost restate it. The black Africans are depicted as lazy, superstitious, chatty, and having a love for imitation. Further, it is claimed that they cannot be developmentally after the age of 15 and that they remain childish their entire life. It is also struck that black African culture has never produced larger ships, buildings, or a written language. But they, on the other hand, have a good memory, vivid fantasy, and they are gifted storytellers. So you have this kind of the usual stuff, the prejudice about different people. Again, here, this is a very long quote here. But the reason why I have this is that there is different sentiment regarding similar fates of dark-skinned Australians and light-skinned Polynesians. So you can see they are writing terrible things about the Australians, that they're the lowest among the Earth's people. And even such a thing, an amazing invention like the boomerang, right? It's an amazing piece of traditional technology. It's stated like it's a primitive tool, right? Among the primitive tools, the boomerang stands out, a curved throwing stick that they handle with great skills. Yeah. And then all attempts to impart a higher civilization to them have proven fruitless. They are continually driven back from the coastal areas by the English settlers and are rapidly diminishing in number. In Tasmania, they are already extinct. So this kind of, they go extinct, these primitive people. But then we see again similar things about the Polynesians then, that in contrast to the Australians and Papuans, they have great aptitude in adopting European customs and Christianity. So they are contrasted. These light-skinned Polynesians are contrasted to the dark-skinned Australians. And there's similar things as we heard before, but then they say that contact with European has, however, been fateful for the Polynesians, whereas infectious diseases and a changed way of life have greatly reduced their numbers. It's likely won't be long before the race has completely died out or through intermixing with incoming Europeans and Asians lost this distinct character. In Swedish, this is actually even more pronounced, like this is a bad thing. This is something sad happening. So it's interesting that the extinction of, or the threat of some people, that's how it works, how nature works, so more or less. And in other examples, it's more tragical, right? And they go on. I think this is this is South America. Then the Botocudos, who belong to the least developed peoples known, are outwardly very unattractive. And this is, this is underlined. It even says ugly, actually. It's a better word. And they describe them then. And they are not made any more attractive by the way in which they attempt to beautify their appearance. So this is also like very a lot of prejudice, and And then they say about Sweden, then in the mountainous regions of Lapland, a few thousand Lapps still roam. These are the country's indigenous peoples, but they are increasingly displaced each year by Swedish and Finnish settlers, and are decreasing in numbers. And the Lapps are of Mongolian origin, small in stature, with broad faces, small narrow eyes, and black lank hair, which is not completely true, but yeah. So these geography books. So race is mainly dealt with in geography books. There's not so much in biology books, but I have a very strange quote here from one biology book from 1947. Strangely enough, the human-like apes of Africa are black like Africans, while the orangutan is yellow-brown like the Malays. This just from nowhere, and I don't know if this was this polygenism of someone called Clutch that said that different humans were originating from different primate species. It doesn't say that, but it's very odd. But otherwise, it's not much about a race in these books in the early 20th century. So
Max, I have a question here. May I?
Yeah.
So how widespread was the use of these textbooks, both the geography and the biology books, in the schools in the country?
These books, these are for the high level then. But generally these were the books used. You couldn't really choose very much what book to use. However, this is a bit strange because there are parallel books. So this from Svensson I'm going to talk about now. This is the most racial ideology book of them all. Then, so this is also from the 30s and the 40s. So
thank you.
Yeah, but they were used by most. Yeah, and this author is strongly influenced by H.F.K. Günther, which is then this German racial theorist. And I will mainly here focus on the European races that he talks about. And he follows the nomenclature proposed by Günther, the Nordic, the Western, that's also called the Mediterranean, the Eastern, the Dinaric, and the East Baltic races. The Eastern is also called the Alpine race. So, and these races are described in long sections, and they are strikingly similar to the corresponding passages in Günther's Europas raser, the racial elements of European history. So, yeah, I have it, copy of it here. So it's very, very similar. What he says about these races. And it's stressed here that linguistic groups are distinct from racial groups and races are strictly biological. But these races then are described in great detail with what they are like, to a silly detail of what, I mean, the Alpine race, they want to save their money. And yeah, I will not go through all of this, but we'll go to some of it that is most important for our present discussion. And these two discussions, as shown one already, also appeared in Günther's The Racial Elements of European History. These are taken from it. A map of the distribution of different races in Europe. And also the difference between the dolichocephalic and brachycephalic skulls, right?
Yeah, this is the Retzius classification, right?
The Retzius classification that Günther is using. But the map here is with his... the classification of these races is not Retzius. This Nordic, Western, Dinaric, this is Günther mainly. And Lundborg, actually. This East Baltic race that he's talking about, that's an invention of Hermann Lundborg, right? Yeah, and then it was most interesting is that what is talking about the Nordic race, of course. You should remember this is in the 30s, and in the 40s this is in geography books in Sweden, and in the 30s, I mean, the Nazis are already in power in Germany, 33 and up till 45. And he says here that over the course of time, the various races have significantly intermingled. This applies especially to the Nordic race, whose warlike disposition, adventurous spirit, and leadership qualities drove it to wide-ranging expeditions. It has been a distinctly ruling race, subjugating other races and establishing realms far beyond its primary area of distribution. So it's a ruling race, it's a master race, right? It's this term, it's a master race. And it's italics in the original. It says that, yeah, we here in Sweden, we are a ruling race, master race. And it is important also that what the Retzius guys and the people at this time, they claim that they have found that the German race, or the Nordic race, that it was later called, it was not as pure as it was anywhere in the world as in Sweden. It's the purest race here, so to say. Yeah, it would be difficult to prove, as some researchers claim. Okay, so here's distancing himself somewhat from Gobineau and Günther here, but not only the empires of the Romans and Greeks, but also the Persian and Indian empires were established by the Nordic race. And even the colonization of North America can only be seen as a conquest by the Nordic race, provided valuable contributions to Italian people, Portuguese and Spaniards. The French people, Russia too has developed from the conquest made by the Nordic race. So, I mean, it's everything every contribution to civilization, so to say, that's been done in Italy or Portugal or in Spain or in Russia or in France. Yeah, that's because they've had this input of the Nordic race. That's the message. Gradually, however, Nordic blood has thinned out. Not at least the race's warlike disposition and ruling nature have contributed to its extinction through battlefield losses. In our day, the birth rates of the Nordic races are lower than those of other races. People with a strong Nordic component, such as the Swedes, are approaching the point where a population decline may be expected. So they are worried here about extinction of the Nordic race. And why is the Nordic race going extinct? Yeah, it's because it's much better than all the races, right? It's the survival, not here of the fittest in a way, but because they are doing all this, they have all these this civilizing projects that they have, so they forget reproducing more or less, right? And they mix with other races when they spread out. Yeah, and then it says here, and this is still from the geography book, in the 30s in Sweden. Among the mental features that distinguish the Nordic race, prominence is given to power of judgment, love of truth, a marked concept of duty, and ability to act. Individuals belonging to this race further are distinguished by a certain lack of insight into the nature of others, are upon social interactions withdrawn and do not readily express their emotions spontaneously in words and gestures. The ruling abilities of the Nordic race have been exemplified in many areas, in warfare and politics, as well as lately in industry. Above all, it will be exactly those traits that will, with such a power, have drawn the people of the Nordic race to the cities. They have also a well-developed sense for nature, which have been of benefit to scientific research, where this race has made the greatest contribution in the field of natural sciences. And there is this thing with the cities. They hate the cities, this entire movement. And originally it's a kind of it's almost Lamarckian in what the cities is doing to the race. This environment is destroying the race, right? So the city is an enemy of the race, actually. You might say, according to this. And then we can contrast this to the East Baltic race. And this is then the Sami people and the Finns that are considered to belong to this race. People of East Baltic race appear for strangers as reserved, brooding, suspicious, and silent, seem easily contented, and persevere in a resolute industriousness. But in spite of the great industriousness, the East Baltic lack success in business because of a disability to make decisions and a lack of sense of reality. He easily becomes a confused dreamer. The creative force of the Nordic race is missing. Sudden emotional change is a distinguishing disposition. The moment offer unlimited wrath, the East Baltic may show great eagerness to reconciliation and to revel in noble feelings. He needs to be ruled, and may, as a servant, show the most absolute submission. So it's really the relation here between the ruler and the one that should be ruled, right? And this is in an era when Germany, on similar grounds, are conquering Eastern Europe and Russia, where they also find this race. So it's quite alarming to find this in Swedish book from this time, actually. And this is, of course, sounds very silly, and they have this similar descriptions of the Alpine race and the Mediterranean race and the Dinaric race, and it's of course laughable if it wasn't so taken so serious and had these very horrific consequences. And of course, in 1945, the author changes. And what does it do? I start with to the left here. So the description of physical traits are virtually identical to the first edition of the races. Description of the mental traits is thoroughly revised. So 1945, this is no longer popular ideas. Parts removed connected to the Nordic thought, with this idea that the Nordic people are superior, that the Nordic race has better ruling capacities than the other races. That's gone. And negative characteristics of non-Nordic races, including the Mediterranean and the Dinaric and what have you, this is removed. And an accumulation of Nordic race in the cities, that's now because of environmental circumstances. It's still said that this race is accumulating in the cities, but it's not because of some intrinsic racial properties that makes it behave in certain ways. So they have still some description of some mental features of the Nordic race. But we see here the people of the Nordic race are upon social interaction withdrawn and do not readily express their emotions spontaneously in words and gestures. Yeah, but that's a bad thing maybe. So, but that's still there now. Within the present distribution range of the Nordic race within Europe are coal resources that have given rise to the great European industrial region. This is perhaps the most prominent reason for the accumulation of people belonging to the Nordic race in the cities. So it's not that they're a special race, it's where they happen to live, or they happen to live where there are coal resources. So that's why they live in cities. So very different, while it's still a little bit similar. People of the East Baltic race appear for strangers as reserved, brooding, suspicion, silent, seem easily contented, and persevere in resolute industriousness. But nothing about that they should be ruled or something like that. And yeah, that's clearly you can't say that in 1945 anymore. He also writes books, same author, in the 1950s. And I have the UN logo here because it hardly mentioned race here. Race is gone in these geography books. And the authors hope that the United Nations will contribute to more accurate information about the peoples. Maybe has been thinking about maybe what I wrote in my earlier geography book, maybe that wasn't accurate information. Just what we were saying here about what other peoples that we didn't know anything about were like, right? So maybe this is kind of you can sense how should you say? He's admitting that he was wrong. And a new way of thinking is needed. Okay, I continue now with in the 1950s with biology books on race. There are actually more in biology books about race in the 50s than earlier. But now then it's gone in geography books. And then let's say here, one much used book here. This is from 1953. Research on human heredity is often called racial biology. So that's human genetics is racial biology. Sometimes, however, this term is narrowed and only applied to that branch of biology which is occupied with the different human races. However, the races are so admixed among each other that one cannot, in a satisfying way, characterize the distinguishing features. So that's very different from before. And even less identify the genes that cause the differences among them. The claims often expressed about foreign races more or less poor genes. So that was said in the decades before. The danger of racial admixture, etc., must therefore be considered in general to be purely subjective judgments. So it's going away from the earlier ideas here, also in the biology books. And then in the 1960s, there is one book here that talks quite a lot about race, but very much from a social perspective. So race riots in the USA are presented. It describes how the Germans under Hitler established extermination camps for Jews, that the perpetrators of these heinous crimes were executed or otherwise punished, but that many are still free. Some even hold important positions in the two German states. The significance of the post-war period for Africa following the abolition of colonies is discussed, and it seems to be that it's seen as a good thing. Although they also say that, there are some countries, like probably they mean the Soviet Union, but they don't say that want to control these countries when the colonizing powers have left the countries. And South Africa's apartheid laws are mentioned as examples of not like this is some biological destiny, but there are human races, and when they meet, sometimes there's problems, social problems. This is the same book. There are actually different editions of the same authors, so it's more or less the same book. And I can continue. In many parts of the world, people of different races that stand against each other. That's what we talked about. And from time to time, it has been asserted that one race possesses qualities that are more valuable than others. Often racial hatred has its roots in ignorance and fear toward what is foreign in other groups. Intolerance of what is different is also an important component of racial hatred. It is important to remember here that the large differences observed between races and populations in, for example, language or culture do not correspond to genetic differences of the same magnitude. Many people, including many leaders in, for instance, politics and literature, do not wish to speak of human races at all. This is natural exaggeration. Even though from a genetic perspective, there is nothing that could be called a pure race. So I stress here that they still say that races are real, but race prejudices is ignorance. And you can't say that one race is more valuable than another. It's ignorance and intolerance of what's different, right? So it's in accordance with what these speeches by Olof Palme from the 60s that I talked about to a large extent. Then they say that, they explain then why then do some people seem more primitive? Why do they have a simpler culture than the European culture? Some environments have been more generous, allowing people to live at a level that from our perspective, might be considered more primitive, such as the pygmy populations in Africa. So it's easier to live, it's possible to live that way there. That's why they are doing it, not because they are primitive. Drawing the conclusion from biological data that one race is generally superior to another is hardly feasible. On the other hand, it is human nature for every race to consider itself superior to all others. From a genetic perspective, a race is a large population in which certain traits appear more frequently than in other large populations. We can distinguish 5 such large populations: the white race, the yellow race, the black race, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, and the so-called Australian Aborigines. I continue here. Also, It is likely
that is very much like the Blumenbach's classification, right?
Yeah, it's to a large extent it's still alive. Yeah, and but they still they are open that it's likely that there may also be certain inherited psychological differences between the races and populations. However, one should be extremely cautious about characterizing races and populations using terms that describe qualities. This like that something is better or worse, like value judgment might be a better translation here. The term mixed race carries a negative connotation for many, and we remember from previous decades that it was very negative connotation for some. The social adjustment for instance, children of color within a white population is widely acknowledged as difficult. However, this difficulty is likely not due to the racial mixing itself, but rather to society's reaction. So it's not like it's bad in any biological sense with mixing races, but we have a social problem when this happens, and that is a reality. I think that's what they are saying. And I continue here. The slides have become a little bit different, but the connection between skin color and climate can easily be studied in the racial type to which we belong, the Caucasian race. That's why the reason why I included this is that it's so obvious that everyone that read this will belong to the same race, which of course was largely the case in the 1960s. Very homogeneous country, but of course impossible today, right? But it's a different age in that sense. But it's also said here that it's impossible to claim that one race is intellectually or morally superior to another, as such traits have not been proven to be hereditary. No such racial differences have been demonstrably found. Regardless of our stance on religion, then it says how should we treat each other? It's a very long section here. It's just thinking about the social implication of race. Regardless of our stance on religion, the principle "do unto others as you would have them do unto you" can serve as a guiding standard among people. So this is, we shouldn't oppress. We shouldn't oppress other races. That's the message. Colonialism is bad, right? That's what you can read from this. Then there is another biology book that mentions, and it's actually how do you know that all humans are the same species? And it actually seems to be referring to Erwin Bauer's old studies there, that a proof of this is that unisons between representatives, even the most distinct races, for example, between whites and Hottentots, offsprings are produced, and these in turn are able to reproduce. So that's stated in 1963. Then they also, although it's still another biology book. So it's a bit interesting because they are still talking about these racial groups, racial sub-races of Ginter, actually. So they said that major racial groups, white, black, and Mongol, are easy to characterize. It's more difficult, however, to distinguish different races within, for example, the cultural nations of Europe. The reason for this is that Western peoples are heavily intermixed. Seeking pure races is pointless. In this racial mixture, we find Nordic, Alpine, East Baltic, Dinaric, and Mediterranean racial types, which can be distinguished based on certain external characteristics, such as skull shapes, facial shape, hair color, and eye color, but nothing on these mental characteristics. But then, when comparing, for example, German, French, and English, the average racial differences between them is relatively small. Individuals within the same people are often much more different from each other than the average racial differences between nations. However, differences in language, history, traditions, upbringing, etc. are often significant. But it's also like comparing Germans, French, and English. you wouldn't expect much racial differences between them, right? So it's not very generous in that sense, I think. And this section later, these are many editions of this book up to the 1990s, actually. And in the 1980s, the basic outlines of racial divisions are maintained, including the European types. But in the editions in the 1990s, there's nothing about race. It's completely removed. And in 1984, they say, and there is no reason to deny that differences between races exist, just as we are all genetically different. But neither race nor the individual person can be valued on this basis. A society without individual variation would not function. I actually had this biology book, I think, in school. So, because I remember this exact quote here. Yeah. So it lives on this European race types. It lives on. And there's also there's a biology book by Arne Myntzing. He was professor in genetics in Lund. He has there's quite a large space in this book how Sami and Finnish elements in Sweden are reflected in blood group frequencies. And this actually, I didn't think much about this when I was studying this the first time, but I later realized that this was a continued part of Herman Ludborg's study, you might say, of the Sami people at the Race Biological Institute, and then I think the medical genetics continued to some extent with the blood group comparisons, which is in a way similar to modern day genomics, comparative genomics. Then there is a very convoluted argument about why all humans belong to the same species, similar to other ones. So like in humans, the experience of hybridization, so this is so many words also that the students today wouldn't be able to read this. In humans, the experience of hybridization between widely different races is admittedly quite limited. But according to available data, intermarriage in such cases has consistently resulted in fully fertile offspring. This also applies to such different races as between whites and Hottentots, and to complicated crossings, where, for example, representatives of different Asian peoples married mulattoes. Then I explain what mulattoes are. Under such circumstances, one must consider that all people on our Earth belong to the same species, and that we are therefore, from a biological point of view, very close to each other. It's like, yeah, you didn't need all this space to say that we're all one species, and we're not that different, and we all can get children with each other. So it's you can sense some kind of reservation here. I don't know, but it's very weird. And it's also in this book, we have this page here, and this shows then the European race types. And this should be the Nordic, the Sami, Alpine, Dinarian, and Mediterranean races. And then one could guess then who is Mediterranean and Dinarian and Nordic. I think the Sami is just possible to identify because of the clothes there on down to the left. Yeah. And I guess the Dinaric and the
bottom left. No? Bottom left.
Yeah, bottom left. Bottom left, that's right. Bottom left, yeah. And I guess the Dinaric and the Mediterranean are some immigrants working at some factory or something. Yeah. So yeah, so this was still this kind of racial classification was still around until the 1980s.
Interestingly, Mats, so far in this last part of the presentation, it seems to be that the Linnaean connection is also missing, right? I mean, there is no explicit mention of Linnaeus as the source of this or of some of the other naturalists that you were talking about in the first part of the presentation.
Actually, I might have this Svedberg he actually mentions that Linnaeus was one that first classified races. So they want him to be a race biology founder, right? I don't think he says anything more about that. It's one interesting thing that they spell his name with a K, not with a C, Carl von Linné, which is, of course, a more nationalistic way of spelling the Swedish way, right?
Yeah.
So, which is interesting. But it's good they pointed it out. He mentioned him. But otherwise, I think he's not much mentioned in this. Okay, then I will go on with eugenics. That's called, see if we have still some time. I can just briefly, in 1928, and that's before the sterilization policies. There is a long section in one biology book that says that it's genetics and evolution is this. I can read it here, that it is to be sure in the interest of the state and society that the generations to come are not recruited from persons with hereditary disease, but as much as possible from the hereditary type best equipped. If the fecundity of the latter is weaker than that of the inferior, the quality of the population will decline. Of course, this is true for the mental as well as the physical properties. Strong arguments speak for the opinion that the destruction of the old civilized peoples was due to a taking over by inferior elements through immigration from abroad and through declining nativity among the best equipped. Not really race here, but it's the same thing. As means for measures of the state hereby, different possibilities have been discussed. For example, lower taxes for heads of the household in proportion to the size of the family, etc. But the question is of a very intricate and also of a delicate nature, among other concerning respect for the personal freedom. However, one must not be blind to the tremendous importance this issue has to society. It is certainly one of its greatest vital questions. This is a school book. This is more like propaganda for interventions. But it's also interesting that they don't really mention sterilization at this time in the biology book. It's very maybe lower taxes for the good guys.
Yeah.
And this is 1953. I think I go on. One should use genetics to try to improve the heritable composition of the people's hereditary material, or at least try to protect it from deteriorations. These efforts are usually comprehended under the concepts of hereditary hygiene. They don't say racial hygiene. So this is like reform eugenics. So racial hygiene is the old term. This is like genetic hygiene or hereditary hygiene. It's the Swedish term for eugenics. It's obvious that one can. This is 1950s. So it's obvious that one cannot straightforwardly on humans apply methods practiced on plant and animal breeding. Hence, one has above all focused on attempts to reduce the spreading of poor genes. In many countries, persons are sterilized that carry, from society's point of view, obviously inappropriate genes. This can be done without causing them any greater personal discomfort. However, one must proceed with the greatest caution. One must be completely sure that the actions are necessary and to the purpose. Also in our country, the laws have been established with this purpose. Mentally ill or feeble-minded individual may not get married. If a person is suffering from such a mental illness, feeble-mindedness, or other disturbances in mental activities, that he, because of this, is not capable to take care of his children or can be assumed to, through his genes, spread his affection to his offspring, he shall be sterilized. Also when he, because of his conditions, is incapable to by himself give an approval to this measure. So this is both the social and the eugenic reasons here, actually. And this endorsed and very clearly presented. Maybe I should not read all of this. This argument is like I can just mention here, we have learned from the theory of evolution that selection is one of the greatest importance, selection is of the greatest importance for the development of a species. In modern society, however, it has partly been given a changed direction, partly neutralized. And then they say then that in the end, modern society, above all, seeks to help those who find it difficult to move forward in life. Clearly, this is our simple obligation. However, we must be clear to ourselves that we thereby put natural selection out of play and can contribute to a deterioration of the population if we do not replace it with something else. So this last part summarizes this, that, yeah, we have put natural selection out of order. We must use racial or in this case, the term is genetic hygiene, eugenics to fix this.
But it's very interesting, no? There is this specific, explicit connection between a notion in evolutionary biology, after all,
yeah,
with the practice of eugenics or hereditary hygiene, no, as it is instead called. Very interesting.
And then there is the same book actually that had this long section with the social, this purely social take on race that we had before, but it's very keen on eugenics, on hereditary hygiene. And it says then that the events during the Second World War has brought about that certain individuals, react very strongly against any talk of hereditary hygiene. At the same time, one must keep in mind that the measures undertaken, or that should be undertaken, only serves to reduce the spreading of severe personal suffering. Society must pay huge sums versus the individual. It's good for the individual. Society must pay huge sums of money for the care of these people, in many cases completely helpless and incapable of any work. We have, fortunately, the opinion in this country that also they in this way sick citizens, as far as the resources suffice, shall get the best care and treatment. So yeah, we should help everyone. We should have a social welfare, but it wouldn't be very expensive with this if we would let everyone reproduce, right? And this is sort of what you found in the Myrdal. Yeah, we should have social welfare, but yeah, then someone will say, yeah, but these inferior people, we can't help them all. It will be bad for the country. Yeah, we must sterilize some of them. The worst cases. It's more or less what they say. And then they continue that it's optional. That you cannot. I mean, you can force anyone. It's quite similar, but I wanted this to say. The last part here is interesting. In the case of hereditary mental illness, the picture is more complicated. It turns out that both very high talent and hereditary mental illness sometimes appear in the same family. That sterilizations as weapons, they use the word weapons, in such cases must be used with the utmost caution is self-evident, if one simultaneously takes into consideration the new and improved treatment methods that have emerged in mental health care. And they have this image then where they clearly explain how it works and that it's not castration. And they say that, yeah, maybe there is some resistance to this. Maybe not everyone wants this. The resistance against sterilization probably is due to a confusion of the operation with castration. Upon castration, the gonads are removed, whereby the sexual drive is lost. Sexual criminals may be cured from their sex inclination by letting themselves be castrated. So they are like, it's not as bad as it seems. It's not. We are not castrating everyone. We're just sterilizing them. Right. And there is also this image. How this is in several books. That this is actually based on a very similar image in Lenz, Menschliche Erblichen und Rassenhygiene, which was the standard German Rassenhygiene. It was also called Rassenhygiene in Germany. How inferior people, if they reproduce more, will take over society after. Yeah, this is depending on how much more they reproduce, how long time it will take for the good people to vanish when the inferior are taking over because they reproduce more. So this was into the 70s. This image was in biology books. They say that it's different fecundity between different classes. So here's the class that, maybe the working class or whatever class is not as smart genetically as the middle class or something like that. I mean, they don't say it explicitly, but it's more like Galton's original thinking about eugenics, I think. But it's up into 1974. And then in 1974, it's the last year of the sterilization policies. And then they say this, and there's also been said in earlier books that, maybe this will not work so much. But like the effect of sterilization may have on a population mean genetic constitution is very small. This is especially the case for recessive genes. If one could determine which persons are heterozygous pairs of the genes, the situation would be different. Lately, one has found that such heterozygote diagnostics is possible concerning several recessive diseases, above all those that involve deficient enzymes. So this is using electrophoresis then. The heterozygote diagnostics mentioned above should be of great importance in hereditary hygienic counseling. So now it's like genetic counseling. And the next year then the sterilization laws are gone. But it's also interesting, I don't have a slide about this, that some social measures such as study loans for students or the study benefits so that you can go to university and get some payment from the state, that is explained that, that this is like important from a genetic hygiene perspective, because it means that clever people that go to the university, they don't need to wait with getting a family, which means that we will not lose their genes from the society. So also some social measures are presented as part of this. So in summary about the books. Geography books increasingly show interest in race as a biological concept in the beginning of the 20th century. The peak are books, I would say, in the 1930s and 1940s, advocating H.F.K. Ginter's racial teachings. The same author largely drops race in the 1950s. Biology books deals with race mainly in the post-war era, largely there's drop. Okay. They they're largely superior to some races. They dismiss it. So there is a word missing here. All racial classifications are presented up to the 1980s, and eugenic is explained at length and promoted from the 1920s to the mid-1970s. I will change this. There was something else there. I wrote this very.
Thank you very much, Mats. This was really a
tour de force. One final slide where I show the
interesting. Yes, please.
The publications where I wrote about this.
Of course, yeah.
So some years ago, and I spent some time reading the things, So.
Yes, exactly. The first publication from 2008 is related to the second part of the talk, whereas the first is related to the first one.
Yeah.
Thank you again, Mats. I think this was really, really, really a big improvement in our understanding of the local specific Swedish context for all of these topics that are interrelated in these very interesting ways. So as we promised, we're going to briefly address what bitter criticism has written in the chat in the YouTube session. So mostly he's commenting about some of the issues that you were talking about during the first part of the talk. His first observation, for instance, was that ancient Greeks came from Sweden. Well, this was part of the model of Rudbeck the Elder, right? So this was not a declaration from Mats Svensson, but it was Mats talking about this historical previous ideas and models that people had in previous centuries, right? And actually, there is a question that Bitter Criticism wrote, which is the following. I'm going to read it directly from the YouTube chat. Is there a debate about racism with authors like Max Weber? I think he's referring to the German social scientist, no? Max Weber, very, very important and influential in sociology, especially. His work was about culture. He wasn't racist, but is very close to the Swedish authors. I believe that some of the Swedish scholars that you were mentioning, especially the ones related to the Racial Biology Institute, I believe. So Lundberg, for instance. So I don't know if you have any comment about this, Mats.
Yeah, I mean, we have all the German names like Eugen Fischer, Fritz Lenz, and Erwin Bauer. Those wrote the main work on it's called Menschliche Erblichkeitslehre und Rassenhygiene. It's human genetics and eugenics. I actually have it because this is interesting. When I was a student in the early 1990s, they were just going to throw away a lot of books in the zoology department, and I found it. Can I take this? Yeah, I took it. So
this
I don't know if they have
Germany,
it at all at the university there, but so I have that copy at least. And it's interesting to read. I just learned that there was a Swedish translation of parts of it. Actually, I didn't know that.
Okay,
but it was very, very, very tight connections with Germany.
Very good. And then Brian Becerra wrote something that's quite important to mention. This is actually connected to one of my final comments. So I'm going to link Brian's observation with something that I was already planning to say. So Mats, where can these sources be found, says Brian? Are they available in digital version? Could you share them? Did you have to visit any archives? This is the part that I was going to raise, no? Where are the archives where historians of science can actually study these papers, these documentations, if they are digitalized, or if you have to go, for instance, to Uppsala to do this research directly? Yes, this is basically the question.
So my general overview of the history, that is, totally based on secondary sources. So I haven't done any research on this. And I can mention there are some very good books, but most of them are in Swedish. And they, of course, have visited the archives. I don't know how much of that is digitalized. There is actually digitalized some of the discussions from I mentioned discussion in 1997, for example, when this was rediscovered. This was considered such so that is summarized and digitalized, but it's in Swedish. But that's quite easy to translate nowadays. So
yes,
there are very many good books in Swedish by this. I mentioned this Maja Hageman, that wrote a book about Herman Lundborg. The only book about him is very good. And she also wrote a book called Rena Landet, the Pure Country, where this is mainly the 1800s, the culture, the Retius and the archaeologists and the connections with figures like Wagner and the culture, the myth, how do you say, the romanticizing of the German past, and all the way up to to Germany, actually.
This tendency of romanticization of Vikings and the Germanic races is actually so pervasive, no? In so many other actually aspects of culture, right? As you were saying, for instance, cinematography, no? You showed actually some pictures, for instance, like oil paintings and so on, but also in cinema and I guess also literature, no? And thank you, by the way, for showing some of the covers of books that have been dealing critically with the stories of some of these authors. Clearly, there is still work to be made in that sense.
Yeah, there are some more books that I've used. It's I think one of the main. I can show this. This is Gunnar Broberg. He wrote about Linnaeus.
Yeah.
In the 1970s. He also actually was a very important researcher concerning this race biology, the institute, when this history was dug up. So he wrote a book about that also. That's main source.
Mm.
And there's also a journalist called Bosse Lindqvist in the early 90s. That's actually when I read this book in the 91 or something.
Mm.
He was starting to talk about the sterilizations in the context of medical ethics also.
Mm. Yeah.
And he also written a book about the latest medical scandal in Sweden. I don't know if you know about the Macchiarini surgeon.
No. Oh, the surgeon. Yes. Yeah. He's
written a book about that also. Yeah. So, and then there are this, but that is very much discussed with, as you can see, with even these graphical novels and several movies. I didn't show all the movies that are dealing with this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then finally, because we are approaching the end of the session, I am going to read Daniela Ballesteros' second comment during this session. Thank you, Daniela, again. She says, thank you very much for sharing your research on such a challenging topic for Swedish society. I think that was very clear, no? That this is definitely a challenge to the mindset of, I guess, a big sector of Swedish society. From my Latin American perspective, says Daniela, with a strong community-oriented bias and in a country like Mexico with a history closely tied to socialism, I wonder, did these kinds of policies affecting the most disadvantaged and marginalized classes drive or motivate a more radical social movement? In Mexico, we have seen caste wars, revolutions, and armed uprisings. What has happened and what is happening in Sweden, I guess, in this context?
Sorry, Brian had a question. Maybe we can put these two together. So can Mats give a answer of both?
Right.
Comments?
So a question that is not in the chat yet?
No, he raised his hand.
I see. Right. So, Brian, would you like to ask something?
No, Francisco. Thank you, Jimena. Thank you, Francisco. And thank you. It's nice to hear you. Nice to see you again. And I just want to say thank you. I gotta leave in a few minutes, so I just want to say my congrats and thank you so much, Mats, for your answer. I have a couple of questions, but maybe can I go by email? Are you okay?
Yeah, you to me? Yeah, that would be. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Mats, and thank you, Francisco.
Gracias, Brian. Disculpa.
So then Daniela's question would be probably the last before Jimena and I round up the session and close it. So I guess in summary, the question from Daniela has to do with if there have been social movements, radical social movements coming from disadvantaged classes in the context of everything that you said during today's session in Sweden.
No, not. I mean, not really. I mean, that is. There was no. I mean, okay, there was if you think about 60,000 people being sterilized, it was still so marginalized, I would say, and mainly this was people in in homes and hospitals even. Like, so they were too silenced to have a voice, actually, I would say, right?
Yeah. But definitely there are people behind the repatriation measures, right? There have been protests that led to that, to those reversals from the state.
Yes, and there is. I can't say too much about those protests, actually, but if we think about there is a very strong, I think, vital protests from the Sami community, mainly through, and it's clearly seen in culture. And I wrote this, I showed this graphic novel, for example. I know they read this in my school when they studied the Swedish subject. They read different kind of literature. This is one piece of literature that everyone reads, right? Of course, yeah. So it's I don't know if it's an answer to the question, but it's there is no like violent or revolutionary, but there clearly is. And I also have friends that with this origin that are trying to repatriate things from museums and so on by themselves. So it's something that goes on.
Very good. Jimena, so if I may, I'm going to just mention the last bit that I still had in mind, that is interesting, I believe, to mention. Yeah, so sure. Besides the archives and archival research that could be done, and probably we're going to continue in touch with you, Mats, we will probably ask also Staffan Müller-Biele about this, given his expertise on Linnaeus and the question of notions and scientific ideas and models about classification in the Nordic region. Besides that, as I commented with you earlier this week or the past week, the issue of the importance that currently human population genomics has in Sweden, with so many high-profile researchers doing this kind of work, even in Uppsala, probably some of them in Stockholm, and in a few other universities in Sweden. How is that connected to the ideological context of all of these different past or previous periods, right? Obviously, none of them is going to be addressing the oldest classifications, but definitely the interest in looking at diversity within the local context, because there are some studies about local problems that are connected to archaeology. So archaeogenetic studies using paleogenomics, and ancient DNA studies, now that this is so important across the world. And also some of these Swedish researchers are also participating in larger groups of research that are trying to go after answers to bigger questions regarding the population of the world, during the Pleistocene or different eras in the recent history of the population of different parts of the planet, including the Americas. So I think that topic is still something that we could still together jointly continue thinking about, because science is always continuous in one way or another with what has happened in the past. So I think it's very interesting still to keep an eye on, from a historical, philosophical, sociological perspective, on how these transformations driven by new technologies are still at the same time connected to discourses from the past.
Yeah, I don't know if you, it's not exactly answer to the question. I don't think anyone feels any connection with the older ideas. I think they are certainly aware of them, right? And it's interesting that this science, when it's presented, it's not so much. I haven't really seen, maybe I missed it, but if it exists, seen any direct linking this with, this is just like the old racialist anthropology, no, I think people see it as something else.
Keeping their distance.
Yeah, no. What I mean is that the general public, when they hear about it, they don't.
I see.
They don't link it as the same thing, right? That you might think that people were doing.
You're talking about the public that reads about this.
Yeah. So there hasn't been any so much, and it's actually a little bit to the opposite, because, for example, one of the findings is that the oldest inhabitants of Sweden, very oldest, were probably had dark skin, right?
In
blue
what
eyes.
is now Sweden.
That the earlier genetic setup of people in Europe was very different than today, right?
Than today's.
And those protesting about this is like nationalists thinking, because there was a TV program showing the history of Sweden, and then this was part of it, and that was like, this is woke propaganda. They are trying to take away our white past. Like
left-wing, politically left-wing propaganda. No, has been a reaction.
So it's not like people think it's a race biology thing to do these things, I think.
Right. Okay.
But also, I mean, sometimes I read this. I don't know. You're probably familiar with David Reich's Who We Are and Where We
Of course, yes.
Yes.
We're familiar with David Reich's books and with him himself, because he has come to Mexico at some point in the past few years in order to try to get access to skulls, in order to do extraction of DNA, of ancient DNA. So that's why we know about him.
But he mentions this, that in the history of population history of Europe, there is that was a Swedish, it's called the battle axe culture.
Right.
This was actually a new group of people coming in to
a migration.
Large extent replacing other people. And then he says in the book that they says we must distance ourselves from the archaeologist Cosina that was basically what was the basis for the Nazis. This migration then went in the other direction because they thought it came from the north, but it still was this idea that one people has come and replaced another people. Sometimes this seems to be true, right? So and that's, of course, it's difficult to deal with the implications of these findings, perhaps, if they can be ideologically charged, right?
Of course, the issue of the weight of all the ideologies is always very complicated to study, but very interesting, fascinating. Thank you very much, Mats. This was, for me in particular, really a wonderful session, and I have been expecting for years actually to be able to get in touch with you again to organize it. So I hope it is not the last time that we talk with you about these issues. I think there is still a lot of room for interactions academically between our contexts to continue understanding much better what is going on and what went on in the past with all of these issues around the notion of race, the phenomenon of racism in the world that we are trying to resist, especially for us, as you would understand, being in Mexico, the context of being the neighbors of the US, for instance, currently is very important for us to keep an eye on. And obviously, what is the way in which physical, biological anthropology can continue to now address these issues critically in order to join an anti-racist stance in academia. Thank you very much again, Mats.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you very soon. And I give the word to Jimenez for the final words.
Thank you, Paco. No, it's just we're very grateful for the organization of these sessions. This is the 10th of the cycle, so it's a great way to close the conversation for this year. And keep in touch because we're going to have an agenda of new conversations for next year. And well, we'll keep in touch and keep talking about these very important topics. So see you soon.
See you, everyone. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you,
Bye,
Max.
and thank you for inviting me.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Gracias a todas, todos
Bye.
y a la transmisión del Sage, como siempre. Hasta la próxima.
Muchas gracias.